r/askreddit. Historians of Reddit, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? Recent history, but it still boggles my mind. Jeri Ryan gets cast on Star Trek, Voyager as 7 of 9. Jeri Ryan divorces her husband. Her ex-husband, Jack, with a really strong resume and a lot of money, announces a Senate campaign in the state of Illinois in 2004. His entry in the race is enough that it is now considered a toss-up. Because both Jeri and Jack are public figures, journalists push for their divorce records to be released, and a major factor in their split was Jack's desire to have sex in public locations. Jack Ryan drops out and the GOP struggles to find a replacement. This led to an overwhelming victory from the Democratic challenger, Barack Obama. The entire Obama presidency exists because some writers in the 90s wanted a big titty boy girl in their show. People, the interracial kiss with you hero will be the biggest impact Star Trek has on racial equality. Jack Ryan, hold my penis in public. Yep, definitely worth the scroll down. We learnt about this at school. In the 1950s in Borneo they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars, thatch that people's homes were made of, and thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which were eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't, and the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly. And that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem led to cats being airdropped into Borneo. Now this one is awesome. But you would think they would have already learned not to fick with the ecosystem. I mean, I'm sure most countries have tried and failed. The Australian cane toad chain event comes to mind. A Chinese man wanted to create a potion to become immortal. Instead he accidentally created gunpowder and made fireworks. A different kind of immortality, I suppose. In 1918, British MP Noel Pemberton Billing caused a major scandal when he accused actress Maud Allan and the wife of the previous Prime Minister Margot Asquith of being at the center of a homosexual ring sabotaging the war effort. Evidence included Allan having performed in a play by Oscar Wilde, and Asquith having attended the performance. He presented his case in an article entitled The Cult of the Clitoris, in which he claimed the exiled Prince of Albania had a black book, listing all the blackmailed homosexuals in Britain. Maud Allan, who was in fact homosexual, Asquith was not, sued for libel, but lost. During the trial, one witness claimed to have seen the Albanian prince's black book, and claimed that the judge's name was in it. That ending is basically a big no you. That's so good, WTF. During the Black Plague, people thought the cats were spreading the disease. They then killed all the cats. The problem is that the cats killed rats, the real source of the plague. The plague now spread faster. You forgot the best part. The plague didn't end because of medical advancements, a return of the cat population, or them even realizing that rats were causing the problem. The major contributing factor was one of the most devastating fires in European history, which burned pretty much all of the lower class areas to the ground, along with all of their rats and sick citizens. The plague ended because all the poor people died in a big fire. Fun fact, fleas were the actual source of plague transmission. Rats, and other animals, carried the fleas. The British government wanted to get rid of the cobras in India, so they started offering money for dead cobras. To take advantage of this, many people started breeding cobras to kill for the money, so they stopped buying dead cobras once they realized it was going on. All of the cobra breeders released the snakes, and there ended up being even more cobras than there had been in the first place. The same thing happened in Vietnam under French rule, with precisely the same effects. A bounty on rats' tails led to a lot of rat breeding, which to an end to the bounty, which in turn led to thousands of rats being released into the sewers. Horses evolved in North America, spread during prehistorical times into Asia, and then later went extinct in North America. If things had been only slightly different, horses could have been native only to the Americas, or just completely extinct by prehistory. Not having horses would have made a huge difference to Asian and European history. No Mongol invasions, no European knights. They would have had to learn to ride pigs instead. That would have been amazing. Camels are actually native to the Americas as well. Imagine elephant cavalry or deer replacing that though. No Indo-Europeans either. Basically around 5,000 years ago, the Indo-Europeans domesticated the horse and conquered all of Europe. If they wouldn't have done that, it's not certain the Bronze Age would have started, and so on and so on. Practically all of Europe, the Middle East and India carry their genes to this day. They were the Aryans Hitler liked so much. The events that led and culminated in the War of the Bucket for sure. Essentially, one Italian state who followed Holy Roman Emperor stole a bucket from another Italian state who followed the Pope. War broke out. The Papal state highly outnumbered the HRE state, but HRE state won. Then stole another bucket. Was a trip for sure when I learned about this one. The bucket is on display in a museum in one of the cities involved. The absolutely amazing shenanigans of Edward Bernays. 1. Was hired by American Tobacco Company to increase their sales. He staged a bunch of protests during an Easter Day parade by getting women to light cigarettes and hold them in the air and call them torches of freedom. Next thing you know, women are legally allowed to smoke. Also made the color green in season to promote Lucky brand cigarettes. 2. Hired by Beeknut Packing, I think, to sell more of their product. Hired a couple doctors to produce these horribly skewed tests, and next thing you know, breakfast is the best meal of the day is born. And of course a hearty breakfast included bacon and eggs. Guess what beech nut sells? 3. Hired by Alcoa to find a way to get rid of their waste material. Pulls the same shenanigans as with the breakfast. Next thing you know, Alcoa is selling all their excess fluoride to put in our public water supply thanks to your dentist. 4. And probably one of the craziest, he was hired by United Fruit Company to stage a coup on the new president. The president wanted to limit the fruit company's grasp on the country, of which the fruit company owned almost everything, and starved their people. He gets the president killed and starts a civil war. THST can still be felt to this day. This dude is the king of chain of events. This doesn't touch on all the crazy shit he did. From making women grow their hair out to help hair nets sell to making cups look like vaginas so that people will be more inclined to buy Dixie cups. This man was an absolute genius at convincing people to do what he wanted. Making cups look like vaginas so that people will be more inclined to buy Dixie cups. Sorry, what? The BBC documentary series Century of the Self has lots of fascinating stuff to say about Bernays, public relations, marketing, and the manufacturing of consent. How did he get the president killed? Recent event. Korean gangster arrested due to illegal gambling. Chain of like 20 events. Korea impeaches the previous president because she was a puppet of a cult. Okay, I need to know the full story on this one. As a boxing historian, probably the story of an ancient Greek boxer named Cleomedes. Apparently while in the Olympic final, he killed his opponent by stabbing his fingers into his opponent's chest, killing him. Which means he loses due to a strange and awesome rule was if your opponent was killed by the fight, he automatically won. So despite surviving the fight, Cleomedes is judged the loser. No glory or olive wreath. Returns home to astophilia and lapses into deep depression. Commits the first mass murder of school children after punching a support beam so hard the school fell down. All the kids die. Angry mob forms to kill Cleomedes, who takes shelter in a giant chest in the temple of Athena. Townsfolk storm the temple and try to pry open the chest. End up having to rip it apart board by board. But when they got it open there was nothing in it. Naturally the people didn't know what to make of it. So they sent people to the Oracle of Delphi, who declared that Cleomedes was the last true Astophelian and that he be worshipped as a demigod. That is how an Olympic boxer became a deity of fertility after murdering a ton of kids. Royal family ain't got shit on ancient Greek crazy. The Miranda Supreme Court decision is one of the best. His case make it so that when you are arrested the police have to tell you your rights, and it became a staple of American TV. What most people do not know is that Ernesto Miranda, the defendant in the case, was a crappy guy, and about 20 years later he was playing poker illegally in a basement of a bar. He got was cheating, and when the people he was playing with found out, they stabbed him with a knife, killing him. The first thing the police did when they arrested the guy that killed Ernesto Miranda was read him his Miranda rights. The real till here is that Miranda wasn't a woman. I thought Miranda rights were that Lin-Manuel Miranda has the right to appear in whatever the fuck he wants. Not a historian, but the current Hong Kong situation is all caused by a murder. A man suspected his GF of cheating while on trip to Taiwan. The man then killed his GF and flee back to Hong Kong. Since there's no extradition arrangement between HK and Taiwan, the HK government introduced a bill that would allow the HK government to extradite any criminals to not just Taiwan, but also mainland China. This has led to people protesting in Hong Kong for more than 3 months now. An ongoing crisis that has caused more than 700 people arrested and 5 people died from committing a suicide. Wasn't the bill also written in such a way that things that aren't illegal in HK but are in China could be theoretically used by China to extradite HK citizens? That's the kind of quality content I'm looking for. I bet HK government thought they were being really sneaky about it too, like, hey, let's just slip this clause in, no one cares about legal stuff. Arab Spring is recent history, but still history. Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor, has his wares confiscated. Unable to combat the police, he goes to the local governor to ask for his wares back, but is refused even a meeting. In response, Bouazizi sets himself on fire in public. It's not the sole reason, but certainly the catalyst for the Arab Spring, which includes civil war in many countries, leaders being ousted and, in cases like Gaddafi, executed. It sees the rise in ISIS, terrorist acts in the Western world, and other conflicts that remain active to this day. All because the police wouldn't give Bouazizi his weighing scales back. Nixon created a chain of events that I find hard to believe. So in 1968 Lyndon Johnson is president. He's a Democrat, and the Democrats are having issues. The party is majorly split up between segregation issues, and they hate the Vietnam War that the country is stuck in. Nixon starts promising to end the draft, and he also proclaimed that he had a plan to end the war. Just before the election that year, on Halloween, a Thursday, LBJ gets on the news and declares that the war is almost over and peace is at hand. The North Vietnamese were participating in peace talks, and all war activity had been suspended. They left the peace talks because Nixon himself told them that if they kept the war going for 1 extra week, he would offer them a better deal once he was in power. So by Saturday, the North Vietnamese had walked out of the peace talks, and the war was back on. The election on the next Tuesday went to Nixon, but barely. The war continued for another 5 years, and in that time 15,000 Americans died, as well as who knows how many Vietnamese. LBJ knew about it at the time, because he had wiretapped the South Vietnamese ambassador as well as several others, and felt he could not reveal the extent of the wiretapping that Americans were guilty of, even if it meant Nixon got away with treason. The start of World War I is a good one. Assassination setting off a chain of events that eventually led to an entire continent becoming engulfed in war. Texas is another interesting one in light of today's political climate. Was part of Mexico that a bunch of Americans immigrated to, mostly illegally, but by Mexican law they were not allowed to own slaves, so they got really mad and rebelled from Mexico so that they could keep owning slaves, and then formed Texas, which eventually became part of the US. You forgot to mention that for about 9 years Texas was literally its own country. Here in Texas we spend most of the year learning about our history rather than anything important. It didn't take long for me to realize that our version of the founding fathers were jerks who kinda just stole a large part of Mexico for America. President Andrew Jackson was walking out of the Capitol building with his buddy Congressman Davy Crockett. A man approached them, drew a gun, but it misfired. The man drew a second gun, which also misfired. Andrew Jackson, fairly old at this point, lifted his cane and began beating the would-be assassin. Normally, people would react with justice served, but Jackson was beating him so badly that Davy Crockett had to pull Jackson off his would-be assassin, who was arrested shortly after. The would-be assassin stood trial, represented by lawyer Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner, and was the first American to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Edit. Crockett was in the House, not the Senate. probably how Pepsi briefly became the 6th largest military in the world. In 1959, President Eisenhower wanted to show the Soviet Union how great America was, so the government set up an American National Exhibition and sent Vice President Nixon there. While Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev got in an argument over communism versus capitalism. As it got heated, the president of Pepsi stepped in and was like, "Bro Khrushchev, chill out, have a Pepsi." Khrushchev must have loved that shit, because then the Soviet Union wanted to permanently bring Pepsi over to their country. The problem is that their money wasn't accepted throughout the world. Instead, like true Russians, the Soviet Union traded vodka for Pepsi. This was all good until the late 1980s when their contract was going to expire and vodka wouldn't cut it for payment. So instead they traded Pepsi a fuck ton of submarines and warships for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. Sadly, instead of terrorizing the seas and shooting harpoons at their enemies, Pepsi decided to sell the fleets to a Swedish scrap metal company. Damn, Pepsi could have gone full East India Company if they had wanted to. The explosion in the use of titanium for things like golf clubs is directly related. If you owned a titanium driver made in the 90s, it probably started life as a Soviet submarine. Till Pepsi could be counted as a military. I am surprised no one mentioned how Henry VI changed the religion of England because he wanted to divorce his wife and get into the panties of a girl. The original Cuban Revolution comes to mind. The first Cuban rebellion was due to the descendants of Spanish-born colonists rebelling against Spain. That revolution failed and many of them were stripped of their properties, which were seized by the victors. Fast forward 10-15 years and another rebellion breaks out, but this time includes freed slaves. The Americans came in at the end of the campaign and the revolution succeeded. The next 50 years saw American economic domination, which led to a series of corrupt and somewhat ineffective governments, which led to the Castro Revolution. Edit. This is all from memory, so if I fuck it up please forgive me. One of my favorites explains why the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle were designed around the width of a Roman horse's ass. So Rome made the roads and the roads grew ruts in them. Ruts created by the standard Roman war chariot at a width of 4 feet 8, 1/2 inches. The Roman chariots were designed to fit the wheels in such a way that 2 horses could pull the chariots and wagons abreast to each other and the wheels not sit directly in the horses' hoof prints. As Europe grew, it continued to use the old roads with the old ruts, so to keep their wagons from breaking less they were designed to fit the old Roman ruts. So a 4 foot 8, 1/2 inch axle. When rail lines were developed in Europe, they were made to match the original axle size of the wagons, as the tools to make this size wagon already existed and it was only a matter of changing the wheel itself to make a basic rail car. When trolleys and simple rail came to the US, it was originally designed by experienced European craftsmen, so it too was designed with the standard 4 foot 8, 1/2 inch axle. As the US rail system grew, it passed through mountains which had tunnels cut through them to fit the trains that ran on the rails as they passed and turned. So that brings us to the SRBs and the space shuttle. The SRBs were designed by a company called Thiokol and built in a factory in Utah, then shipped by rail to Florida. This meant the SRB's width had to be planned to fit through these tunnels that the rails passed through the mountains, which were designed to match the European rail line standards, which were based on carts that had to match the old Roman roads, which were rutted by chariots that were designed to fit the width of a horse's ass. And that is the connection between the width of an old Roman horse's ass and the US space program. Imo Rise of Islam. So it started as an old man Muhammad who claimed to have got a message from God. He starts preaching and gets thrown out of the city for heresy. He moves to another where people are move accepting. However, he got stuck in there for years. Eventually, after a series of wars and battles, Muhammad conquers and enslaves most of tribes in Arabia, creating the first united Arabic state. However, while this was going on, in the north Byzantine and Persian empires have fought a series of wars which lasted for decades. These wars totally devastated the landscape, leaving it depopulated and very poor. This situation allowed this Arabic state, a very obscure and negligible tribal confederation, to conquer entirety of Middle East, completely absorbing the Persian Empire, and conquering 70% of Byzantine Empire, practically unopposed. If these events had not transpired in such fashion, then Islam would most likely remain an obscure and minor religion focused primarily in Arabia. And Middle East would remain majority Christian and Zoroastrian. Now that would be an interesting alternate history to see. Obligatory World War I, development of hentai. World War I, Treaty of Versailles, World War II, RIP Nagasaki and Hiroshima, MacArthur shapes Japanese constitution in a way that restricts sexual expression, hentai. Which came first though, hentai or tentacle porn? Pretty much the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR was already crumbling by this point, and so they agreed to allow the wall to be opened for a bit. Well, the guy in charge over in Berlin didn't really get the point across to the public very well, and as a result everyone assumed that the wall was permanently coming down. This led to pretty much all of East Berlin flocking to the wall and demanding to be let through. The guards there knew there was no way to restrain all these people without a massacre occurring, and the Russian government had no real way of easily fixing the huge mistake. And so the Berlin Wall fell, all because of a misinterpretation. I was there that day, it was magnificent. One of my earliest memories watching it being pulled apart and people celebrating and random David Hasselhoff. I have a piece of that wall. The independence process of Latin American countries, where it wasn't the local natives revealing against the crown, it was Latino-born Spanish men that were fed up with the crown, so they fought for the independence of the colony. 4 Roman emperors in 1 year, and of course it's 69 AD. Nice. Caesar, probably. If Gavrilo Princip never stopped for a snack at that cafe, he never would have shot Franz Ferdinand. That would have never started World War I with the particular political alliances of the moment. Which meant Russia wouldn't have been ground into dust by Germany economically while Germany lost the war. Which means communism never would have taken hold in Russia, while Nazism wouldn't even exist. Which means World War II and the Cold War would have never happened. No Cold War means no American involvement in Vietnam, which led to the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Hippies. Disgusting dirty hippies. I just told this story on another sub. But the story of Arlington National Cemetery is a strange one indeed. Arlington Plantation, originally settled by none other than George Washington's adopted son, George Washington Parke Custis. He built the ornate mansion as a tribute to George Washington, creating a museum, or first presidential library. His Mary Custis married up-and-coming West Point grad, Robert E. Lee. During the Civil War, the Lees evacuated Arlington and it was seized by the Union for unpaid taxes, a total of $91. Mary Lee had sent payment via courier, but the payment was refused as they wanted her to pay in person, which wasn't going to happen during the war. The Union began burying their war dead in Lee's front yard, so that every day Lee would be forced to realize the damage he'd done to his former country. After the war, the Lees sued the federal government in order to regain ownership of Arlington Plantation. The suit took many years to play out and ended at the US Supreme Court, favoring the Lees' complaint. The Lees has passed in the interim. The heir to the Lees estate, Robert E. Lee Jr., who actually had a brother named George Washington Custis Lee, had no interest in trying to re-establish the plantation at Arlington. Thousands of graves in the front yard may have been a deterrent. Therefore he offered to sell Arlington to the federal government, which accepted the offer. As luck would have it, then Secretary of War, now the Sec of Defense, Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln, presented a check, about $100,000, to Robert E. Lee Jr. to settle the matter once and for all. How's that for a reconciliation act, and beginning of reconstruction of our union?